It starts with a crumb. Just one. Dropped quietly on a damp forest path. A whisper of direction. A wish wrapped in crust and hope. The moon hangs low, pale and round as a coin, watching as two small figures walk hand in hand beneath the trees. They do not run. They do not cry. They walk, together, steady and quiet, following nothing more than breadcrumbs and moonlight. Tonight, we won't meet them with fear, or fire, or wickedness. We'll walk softly beside them, through rustling leaves and warm bread dreams, through candy walls and quiet cunning. Welcome to Sleepy Journeys, the podcast designed to lull you into a peaceful slumber with soothing stories through time, places, and ideas. Whether you're winding down after a long day or simply looking for a peaceful escape, you're in the right place. My name's Jack, and I'm so happy to have you here with me. Each night on Sleepy Journeys, we set off together on gentle adventures designed to soothe your mind and ease you into rest. You'll find journeys through history, comforting fairy tales, myths and folklore, the wonders of science, fascinating inventions, inspiring famous figures, music history, and even calm explorations around the world. No matter where your curiosity takes you, there's a dreamy, Sleepy Journeys show for you. Tonight, we're going to follow breadcrumbs in the moonlight through the tale of Hansel and Gretel. And just before we fully drift off, if you're enjoying Sleepy Journeys, go ahead and tap follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're joining me on. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming sleepy adventures. And let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us. Now, close your eyes. Follow the soft trail of crumbs beneath your feet, lit by moonbeams that do not waver. The tale of Hansel and Gretel is not just one of witches and candy walls. It is also one of love, cleverness, and the steady return to what we call home. The path is waiting. The forest is listening. Now, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The forest, at the edge of all things known and near, begins with a hush. There, under the cover of dusky skies and gentle breezes, where the twilight lingers like a silken scarf, a tale begins. One that has wandered down through time, softened by the years, and now approaches on quiet feet to rest beside you. The path we'll walk tonight winds through trees that listen, where leaves shiver with stories not yet told, and moonlight catches in the branches like threads of silver lace. Long ago, in a land stitched together by forests and low mountains, there stood a small cottage on the border between field and wood. This cottage, humble and still, pressed itself gently into the earth as if it did not wish to be noticed by the vast trees behind it. Inside lived a small family, and while their lives were quiet, the air always seemed to carry the scent of something changing. Like the wind turning a corner before a storm, or the chill that touches your skin just before the season slips into winter. It is here, in this quiet threshold between home and wild, that two children once played, Hansel and Gretel. Their days were not ones of grandeur or riches, but instead filled with the small sounds of a simple life, The soft thud of wood being stacked, the rustle of hens and straw, the sigh of their father as he sat at the table in the pale gold light of dawn. Nights were quiet, and dreams were many. At the edge of the forest, where the trees stood like patient guardians, and the wind spoke only in murmurs, there rested a cottage the color of soft clay and weather-worn wood. Its roof, sagging just slightly at the edges, wore a gentle blanket of moss that changed hue with the seasons, emerald in spring, golden in autumn, and muted gray beneath the winter snow. Around it, a narrow garden grew, not wild, but not quite orderly either, where time crept among cabbages and tall sunflowers turned their heavy heads toward the sun. Within its simple walls, life stirred with the quiet cadence of repetition. The sun filtered through one small window each morning, casting warm light across a hand-hewn table where a tin mug and a single ceramic bowl often rested. The floors creaked not in protest, but in welcome, each step an old friend returning. Hansel and Gretel rose each day to the soft scrape of firewood being stacked, the murmur of their father's voice as he coaxed life back into the coals. Their mornings began not with alarms or hurry, but with the scent of boiled oats and the rustle of kindling. Gretel would rub her eyes with the heel of her hand, still warm from dreams, while Hansel would tiptoe to the window, always hoping to see something new beyond the familiar bend in the trees. Their father, a woodcutter by trade, bore the marks of his work upon his hands, calloused, strong, and slow in movement. His eyes, though often rimmed with tiredness, carried kindness within them like embers that never went out. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with the softness of bark under morning dew. Their stepmother, by contrast, moved with more pointed gestures, her lips often pressed into a line. Yet even she, in the earliest of hours, could be found staring into the trees as if remembering something half forgotten. Though she rarely smiled, there were moments, fleeting and small, when her fingers would pause mid-task and her gaze would settle gently on the children as they played. Days in the cottage passed like drifting leaves, unhurried, each one brushing against the next. There were chores, of course, but even these were quiet, gathering herbs, brushing dust from corners, collecting twigs from the edge of the woods. The rhythm of the household was not measured in clocks, but in the length of a shadow on the wall, or the sound of a distant owl calling too early. Hansel liked to carve small animals from fallen branches, the curl of wood peeling away like tiny whispers. Gretel, meanwhile, would hum soft tunes to herself as she arranged stones into shapes in the dirt outside, her fingers painting patterns the wind would soon erase. Their laughter was not loud, but it lingered, like the fragrance of mint leaves on fingertips after picking. At night, the cottage sighed. Its beams creaked as they settled. The hearth glowed faintly with leftover warmth, and outside, the forest curled in on itself like a slumbering giant. Hansel and Gretel would lie close beneath a threadbare blanket, their dreams filled with birdsong, stars between branches, and the promise of another gentle morning. In that space, on the edge of wildness and hearth, their world felt steady, even as something quiet began to shift in the winds beyond the trees. The wind, once soft and playful at the edges of the wood, began to shift. It came now with a cooler breath, brushing through the trees with a more somber tone. The days grew leaner, and the once plentiful garden offered fewer gifts. The cabbages no longer fattened in their rows, the hens grew silent, and the oats in the burlap sack dwindled to a whisper of grain at the bottom. Inside the cottage, the change was felt most in silence. Where mornings once held the comfort of simmering pots and the scrape of wooden spoons, they now arrived with quiet footsteps and the hollow echo of cupboard doors opening to almost nothing. The children noticed it in the way their father lingered longer by the hearth, stirring ashes that offered no warmth. His shoulders, already bowed from work, seemed to dip a little lower, as though carrying a weight unseen. Their stepmother, once simply stern, became brittle. Her voice, though never loud, sharpened around the edges like frost clinging to leaves. She counted the remaining loaves with pursed lips and hands that trembled just slightly, though she tried to hide it. Each meal became smaller, each bite more slowly chewed, and the spaces between meals stretched longer than the children were used to. Hansel, ever observant, watched the shadows deepen, not just outside, but within. He began saving small bits of crust, tucking them into a fold of cloth, just in case. Gretel followed suit, wrapping dried leaves in bundles of twine, pretending they were little parcels of food to feed the birds, or the trees, or perhaps dreams. They did not speak much of the hunger, for to give it words would be to invite it closer. Their games changed too. Where once they built towers of stones and driftwood, now they lined them up as if marking paths. Gretel traced winding trails with her finger in the dirt, murmuring made-up names for each bend, while Hansel imagined how far they might go if they ever had to walk into the forest and keep walking. The wind seemed to listen. It rattled the shutters gently at night, not with anger, but with insistence. It carried the faint rustle of distant branches creaking under their own weight, and sometimes, if one listened closely enough, the murmur of stories the trees had heard before. One night, when the stars hid behind a clouded veil and the fire had long burned to cinders, the children heard voices, low and urgent, drifting through the cracks in the wooden walls. Their father's voice, tinged with sorrow, and their stepmother's, firm and clipped, like cold iron. They didn't catch the words, only the tone. And it was enough. Something was coming. Not loudly, not suddenly. It moved like the shifting season, slow and certain. A change that could not be seen all at once, but could be felt, settling in the bones like a chill, like a hush, just before the leaves fall. Hansel and Gretel lay awake longer that night, the blanket pulled high beneath their chins, the flicker of uncertainty nesting where dreams usually lived. Outside, the trees swayed gently, and the forest waited, as it always had, quiet and vast, ready to receive whatever steps might come next. Morning arrived with a thin gray light, the kind that carries no warmth, only a quiet urging to begin the day despite the stillness in the air. Hansel and Gretel were already awake, tucked beneath their shared blanket, unmoving, listening to the faint stirrings of their father in the next room. The voices from the night before had settled like dew on their thoughts, and now the morning felt different, more hollow, more hushed. Their stepmother called them in a tone as flat as the sky. She handed them each a crust of bread, rough and dry, and said they would walk into the forest to gather wood. Her eyes did not meet theirs. Their father, behind her, stood with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly between his fingers. He said nothing, but there was something in his gaze, something heavy and far away. Hansel took Gretel's hand as they stepped out into the morning chill, the forest ahead shrouded in a pale mist. The trees loomed like tall, silent figures wrapped in shawls of fog. Each step on the damp path pressed soft indentations into the soil, as if the forest itself was listening to their footfalls. Hansel, quietly thoughtful, had brought his piece of bread not to eat but to mark the way. As they walked, he crumbled it little by little, letting small pieces fall behind them. They fluttered to the earth like pale feathers, landing among roots and moss, little signposts pointing backward toward home. Gretel noticed his careful drops and said nothing, only tightened her grip around his fingers. They didn't speak much. Words seemed too loud for the forest, which pressed in on all sides with a hush that discouraged sound. The deeper they went, the more the light softened, filtered through high branches that swayed gently above them. The air held the scent of damp bark and fading leaves. Birds watched from still perches, blinking slowly as if half dreaming. At last, their stepmother stopped in a clearing surrounded by towering firs. She handed their father a dull hatchet and gestured toward the underbrush. The children were told to sit and wait while the grown-ups collected wood. But as soon as the hatchet struck a nearby trunk, the sound ringing through the trees like a chime, the parents turned and drifted quietly away, footsteps muffled by moss and leaf litter. Hansel and Gretel waited. They listened to the sound of chopping, steady and far off, until even that faded into nothingness. The woods grew still again. Only the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirr of a distant cricket remained. The children sat shoulder to shoulder on a fallen log, the crust of bread long gone, crumbled into a trail they could no longer see. Gretel leaned against Hansel, and he rested his chin lightly atop her head. They did not cry. Not yet. Instead, they listened. They waited. And they trusted, in some small way, that the breadcrumbs behind them would light a path like stars on the forest floor. Above them, the trees swayed in slow rhythm, and somewhere far off, the forest exhaled. As the sun dipped lower behind the canopy, a muted silver began to pool between the trees, like moonlight spilled from a slow-moving stream. Shadows stretched long and delicate across the forest floor, and with them came a quiet that felt both tender and vast. The world grew softer, not darker, as twilight took hold, cloaking everything in a gentle hush. Hansel and Gretel sat side by side, unmoving for a time, as if their stillness might somehow slow the coming night. But the light continued its slow retreat, replaced by a glow more pale and dreamy, as the moon, large and full, rose to its place above the treetops. Its rays filtered down through the branches like silver threads, weaving light across bark and stone, illuminating the moss and leaves with a quiet kind of magic. Hansel stood first, brushing the dirt from his trousers and glancing back along the path they'd taken. His heart sank. Where he had dropped his crumbs with such care, now there was nothing. Not even a glint of crust or a speck of dust remained. The forest floor, damp and ever-moving with tiny lives, had taken them. Birds, mice, or the wind itself, whatever had claimed them, the trail was gone. He did not tell Gretel right away. Instead, he took her hand, and together they began walking, not forward, not backward, but simply into the softness between the trees. They moved slowly, as if wading through a dream, each step cushioned by layers of pine needles and fallen leaves. The woods at night did not feel threatening, but instead surreal, as though they'd stepped into a place only half awake. The usual rustlings of animals quieted into the background, replaced by the gentle creak of limbs swaying high above and the sound of their own breathing. The path, if it could be called that, was dappled with moonlight. Pale beams caught in spider webs and lit the smooth backs of stones with a kind of silvery warmth. The forest, in this hour, was no longer a place to fear. It was an ancient space, one that had watched many travelers pass, some with maps, some with only their hearts to guide them. Gretel looked up, her eyes reflecting the moon above, and pointed to a branch where an owl sat silently, head tilted just so. It did not blink, nor stir, but watched them as if it knew their names, had always known them, and perhaps was waiting to see what they might become. Hansel followed her gaze, then smiled faintly. The forest was changing around them, not shifting shape in a frightening way, but blooming into something else, something almost enchanted. They began to move with more confidence, following the moonlight where it shimmered most brightly on the ground, trusting it to lead them somewhere, anywhere, that felt like safety. Though they didn't know it, the forest was watching. Not with eyes, but with breath and stillness. It welcomed them in its own quiet way, and for now it gave them passage. The moonlight painted their faces with calm, and the trees whispered soft lullabies in a language only the wind understood. And so they walked, two small figures beneath a vast sky, threading their way gently through moonbeams and memory, leaving behind the hunger of day and stepping into the dream of the forest night. Morning did not break with bright fanfare, but with a pale, diffused light that tiptoed into the woods like a thought remembered just after waking. The air had grown warmer, slightly, as though the trees themselves wished to offer comfort to the two small travelers beneath their boughs. Dew clung to every leaf and needle, shimmering softly in the growing light, while the silence stretched, unbroken, like the pause before a sigh. Hansel and Gretel wandered slowly, their limbs heavy not only from sleep, but from the quiet weight of not knowing where to go. Their feet brushed aside fallen leaves, their shoes damp and soft with wear. They did not speak much, for even their voices felt like they belonged to another world, one behind them. And then, a scent. It came like a ribbon on the breeze, first faint, then stronger and unmistakable. Sweet, rich and warm. A scent of sugar melting, of cinnamon and baked apples, of warm bread fresh from the oven. The kind of scent that clings to memory and makes even the coldest days feel like home. The children stopped in their tracks, noses lifted slightly, drawn forward without hesitation. They followed the scent as one might follow music heard faintly from far off. Between ancient oaks and clusters of holly, the forest gave way slowly to something unexpected. There, nestled in a small clearing, stood a cottage unlike any they had ever seen, not made of stone or wood, but of sweetness and wonder. Its walls were gingerbread, golden and soft-looking, with patterns etched in sugared icing that curled like vines. The windows were clear, glinting sheets of spun sugar, and the roof was shingled with cookies dusted in powdered snow. Peppermint sticks lined the walkway, which itself was paved with chocolate tiles. Lollipops grew like flowers in neat rows beside the door, and over the chimney wafted a smoke that smelled faintly of vanilla and cloves. The air shimmered with sugar crystals catching the light. Gretel blinked and rubbed her eyes, unsure if she was still dreaming. Hansel reached out and touched the corner of the house with cautious fingers. It felt warm, real, and gave slightly under his touch, just as cake might. He pinched off a corner and tasted it, a soft crumble of spice and honey that melted on his tongue. His eyes widened with surprise and joy. They approached the doorway slowly, stepping over jelly bean cobbles and past walls frosted with delicate designs. The scent surrounded them, as comforting as a blanket, as if the very air had turned to dessert. Birds chirped nearby, brighter now, their songs light and fluting. The forest seemed to approve of this sweet interruption, and the cottage itself stood quietly, waiting. They nibbled small pieces with care, cautious, polite, unsure of whether they should take more but unable to resist. Gretel found a gumdrop nestled in the eaves and smiled for the first time in what felt like days. Hansel laughed softly, then stopped himself, almost surprised to hear his own voice in joy. It felt, for the first time in days, like hope. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both felt it. This cottage, this place of sugar and quiet wonder, had appeared for them. As though the forest, sensing their need, had conjured it from mist and memory and sweetness. The door creaked open just slightly, as if it had been listening too. Inside the sweet-shelled cottage, the air shifted. It no longer carried the weight of the forest's hush, but a different kind of stillness, warmer, thicker, like the pause between two verses of a lullaby. The door, left ajar, gave way without resistance as Hansel gently nudged it open. A soft creak echoed, not harshly, but like an old sigh, and the scent of baked apples, nutmeg, and soft sugar grew stronger with each step. The room they entered was dim but cozy, lit by the golden flicker of a small hearth set into the gingerbread wall. Flames crackled gently beneath a kettle that puffed steam with a hint of honey. A worn wooden table stood in the center, its legs stout and steady, with two little chairs tucked neatly beside it. The walls, lined with cupboards and shelves, bore jars of sweets and bundles of dried herbs tied with colored twine. And then, quiet footsteps. From a doorway veiled by a curtain of caramel-colored fabric, emerged an old woman, stooped and small, wrapped in shawls the color of faded candy canes. Her eyes were pale and unfocused, like pools of moonlight, but they held something softer than malice. She smiled, slow and creased, her voice no louder than a whisper over warm milk. "Well now," she said, her tone more curiosity than command. "Come in, come in. You must be chilled to the bone." Hansel and Gretel hesitated, but the warmth of the fire and the gentle rhythm of her voice coaxed them forward. She ushered them inside without haste, her hands fluttering around them like moths tending a lantern. She did not ask questions, only offered soft cushions, warm broth in earthen mugs, and little slices of something sweet on tiny plates with curved edges. They ate slowly, unsure if they ought to trust, but unable to resist the comfort that settled in with every mouthful. The old woman sat nearby, humming softly, weaving her fingers through the air as if pulling invisible threads. Her eyes drifted now and then toward Hansel, toward Gretel, but without sharpness, more like someone remembering a dream. The fire crackled and popped. Outside, the light faded into evening once more, though the world within the cottage felt untouched by time. Gretel leaned into the softness of a quilt the woman had draped across her shoulders. Hansel dozed briefly, chin on chest, crumbs dusting his sleeve. The air was heavy with warmth and scent, and the walls no longer seemed strange, but familiar in the way of lullabies long forgotten. They did not notice the slight narrowing of the woman's eyes when she turned away, or the way her fingers curled around the edge of her stirring spoon just a little tighter. They were too tired, too full, and too soothed to see anything but kindness in her slow, steady movements. Even the cottage seemed to breathe with them, walls rising and falling gently, the way a child's chest moves in deep sleep. Outside, the forest stood still. And inside, the tale drifted on, quiet and slow, as the door softly closed behind them, settling into its frame like the final note of a song. Time passed differently within the sugar-shelled cottage. The sun still rose and fell beyond its candied windows, casting soft beams across the floor in golden ribbons, but the rhythm of the days blurred. Morning, midday, and evening folded into one another like layers of pastry, delicate and indistinct. Hansel and Gretel settled into the strange comfort the cottage offered. Their beds were not straw-filled pallets, but thick quilts atop warm cushions that smelled faintly of vanilla. Each morning, the old woman provided warm porridge sweetened with fruit and soft rolls spread with honey. She never hurried them, never scolded, but always watched from the corner of the room with eyes that gleamed like dull pearls. Hansel spent his mornings near the window, carving tiny animals from sugar-stiffened dough she gave him, while Gretel dusted shelves or stirred pots that steamed with soft, fragrant clouds. The chores were light, the tasks simple. There was no sharpness to her voice, no crack of command. And yet, an invisible thread seemed to tug them gently away from the door. No matter how sweet the air or kind the tone, they could feel the subtle weight of stillness, like syrup, slowly hardening. The old woman's movements were measured, her footsteps always soft, but her presence filled the small house like a rising tide. She never left them alone for long. She'd smile gently and hum as she moved about, her fingers never quite still, always tying or folding or stirring. Her voice, when she spoke, was full of riddles and rhymes that never quite meant what they seemed to. Hansel grew quieter as the days wore on. He noticed, without drawing attention to it, that he was being fed more than Gretel, offered second helpings with an insistence that grew each day. She, meanwhile, was kept busier, sweeping, organizing, gathering ingredients the woman handed her in small woven baskets. Sometimes, at dusk, Gretel would glance out the sugar glass window and press her hand against it, her breath clouding a small circle in the pane. The forest remained just as it had been, wide, still, and waiting. But something in the wind had changed. It no longer whispered lullabies. It paused, as if holding its breath. Their dreams grew strange. Hansel dreamt of birds flying overhead, dropping crumbs that vanished before touching the ground. Gretel dreamt of staircases made of licorice that dissolved beneath her feet. They both awoke each morning a little more tired, as though the night offered no rest, only wandering. Still, they smiled politely. Still, they ate their meals. Still, they performed the daily tasks they were given, too uncertain to protest, too comforted by the warm walls to question why the door remained gently barred from the outside each evening. It was not a harsh prison, but a velvet one. And the forest, which had once seemed vast and full of possibility, now hovered outside like a memory that could not be fully reached. And within it all, the old woman moved like a ghost through sugar and silence, waiting too, for what they did not yet know. It began with a feeling, a soft flicker in the stillness, like a candle just starting to remember its flame. Gretel, quiet and watchful, began to notice things she hadn't before. The way the old woman's eyes lingered too long on Hansel's frame. The way her fingers flexed, absent-mindedly, as if measuring something invisible in the air. And most of all, the way the warmth of the cottage now pressed too close, like a blanket that had stopped comforting and begun to smother. One morning, while Hansel was asked to rest near the hearth and sip from a heavy mug of cream and nutmeg, the old woman pulled Gretel aside. Her smile, as always, was mild, but her words were different. "We must keep your brother strong," she said softly. "He is special. You will help me, won't you, dear? Keep the fire hot. Sweep out the ashes. Prepare the kettle. Gretel nodded, her mouth moving before her thoughts could catch up. She felt her stomach twist, not from hunger, but from understanding. The pieces of the story were finally falling into place. The gentleness was a veneer. The sweetness, a curtain. That evening, as the light faded and the sugar glass windows dimmed with shadows, Gretel found Hansel sitting quietly, his hands folded in his lap, a look of calm on his face. But his eyes, when he glanced up at her, were sharp and clear. "She's waiting," he whispered, barely more than breath. Gretel nodded. "I know." They didn't speak further, for even the walls seemed to listen. Over the next few days, their plan unfolded not with sudden leaps, but with cautious steps. Gretel, now tasked with keeping the hearth hot, began to study its every brick. She noted where the iron latch lay, how the flue turned, how the coals behaved when left untended. She swept and stirred and watched. Hansel, meanwhile, began hiding small bits of food, a roll here, a corner of tart there, tucking them under the quilt or beneath loose floorboards, conserving his strength. When the woman asked to touch his hands or feel his arms, he would pass her a thin bone instead of his own finger, hiding it in the folds of his sleeve. "Still not fattening," she would mutter, frowning with confusion. "Still so thin." Her patience, like her sweetness, began to crack. Then, one morning, she gave the order. The oven must be heated high. Gretel must help prepare it. Hansel must be ready. Her voice no longer curled like spun sugar. It had hardened into something brittle. Gretel stood before the open hearth, its mouth wide and yawning. The old woman leaned close beside her, gesturing at the fire, telling her to crawl in, to check the coals, to test the heat. "But I don't know how," Gretel murmured, her voice quiet, her eyes wide. The old woman clicked her tongue, irritated. "Like this," she said, crouching down to demonstrate. And in that soft, exact moment, Gretel moved. A push, not fierce, not violent, but sure. The old woman stumbled forward, her balance gone, her weight caught by the oven's edge. With a sound like the crumpling of dried leaves, she fell inward. Gretel closed the door gently. No scream echoed. No protest came. Only the hush of finality, the sound of an old fire sighing back into itself. She turned, found Hansel waiting with his hand outstretched, already standing by the door, his eyes filled not with fear, but with steady relief. They didn't speak, only moved, first to gather what they could: a pouch of dried fruit, a few jars of clean water, and a small bundle of shimmering coins hidden behind the cupboard. Then they stepped once more into the woods. And behind them, the cottage stood, silent and still, as though nothing had ever happened at all. The door to the gingerbread cottage closed with a quiet click, like the closing of a storybook gently set aside. Hansel and Gretel stood just beyond its threshold, not rushing, not speaking, as though the forest itself had paused to breathe with them. The air outside felt cooler, clearer, no longer heavy with sugar and heat, but touched instead with earth and pine and the faint perfume of dew rising from the moss. Behind them, the cottage remained still. The smoke no longer curled from its chimney. Its sweetness lingered faintly in the air, but it no longer beckoned. The warmth it once promised had been a cage, and now that cage had cooled. They walked without a path, but with a sense of direction deeper than maps. The forest, ancient and knowing, seemed to step aside for them now. Brambles bent out of the way. Branches lifted just slightly. Leaves muffled their footsteps like cushions, and for the first time in many days, the trees did not watch with uncertainty. They watched with quiet reverence. Though the oven fire had consumed the darkness that once stirred in the Candy Cottage's heart, the memory of it did not vanish. It softened. It took on the form of steam rising into the canopy, of warmth that no longer threatened but comforted. Gretel held Hansel's hand tightly as they moved, their pace steady and unhurried. There was no need to flee, no need to look back. As they walked, they passed things they hadn't seen before. A small grove filled with tiny purple flowers that bowed their heads as the children passed. A cluster of mushrooms that glowed faintly beneath the bark of a fallen log. The forest was the same, and yet changed, gentler, kinder, as if it had been holding its breath and now let it go in a long, satisfied sigh. In a clearing not far from where their journey had turned strange, they stopped to rest. Hansel spread a small cloth on the ground and carefully opened the bundle they had taken from the cottage. Inside were gold coins stamped with faded marks, a few jeweled trinkets, and a locket containing a picture so old its lines had nearly faded into blankness. They stared at it not with greed, but with awe. Relics of something long forgotten, treasures born not of desire, but of survival. They didn't know what the gold would mean. They didn't even know the way home yet. But the forest did. That night, they built a small fire, one that danced low and soft, casting shadows that swayed like lullabies. They ate a little, leaned against one another, and looked up at the stars blinking between branches. There was no fear in their silence, only rest. Only stillness. The kind that comes after courage has carried you through something too large to name. Somewhere behind them, the cottage stood quiet, its sugar walls beginning to melt with the sun's slow warmth. It would vanish eventually, piece by piece, reclaimed by wind and rain, by time and root. Until one day, there would be nothing left but a clearing where the grass grew a little sweeter and the air held the memory of cinnamon. But Hansel and Gretel would carry its lessons with them always, etched not into their skin, but into the way they looked out for one another, the way they walked side by side. And onward they would go, not as children lost, but as children found. The morning after the fire, the forest felt quieter, as if it were allowing Hansel and Gretel a moment to gather themselves before continuing. The light, soft and low, pooled between tree trunks in gentle golds and silvers. The scent of sugar had faded almost entirely now, replaced by the rich aroma of soil, bark, and dew. The air had shifted, still cool, but no longer burdened with the weight of enchantment. The children moved carefully through the cottage one final time. Its once delicate details had begun to dull. The peppermint fence now slumped with melting stripes, the frosting along the eaves cracked and crumbling, and the gingerbread walls, still warm to the touch, had started to soften under the forest's embrace. They did not linger long. Hansel found a small wooden box beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen. It was old, dusted with flour and sugar, and bound with a faded ribbon. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, were coins and trinkets, rings with tiny stones, a locket that clicked softly when opened, a brooch shaped like a flower with one petal missing. These things, dull in color but rich with time, were not prizes but echoes. Not treasures taken, but remnants left behind. Gretel discovered a small pouch hanging behind a cupboard door. Inside were dried apples, a handful of sugared nuts, and 2 pieces of dark chocolate, carefully wrapped in waxed paper. She held the pouch close, feeling the care that had once packed it. Perhaps it had belonged to another child long ago, or perhaps it had waited for them all this time. They gathered only what they could carry in 2 modest bundles, the pouch of food, the wooden box of tokens, and a small blanket that still held warmth. No more. The rest they left behind, letting the forest reclaim what it would. In one quiet corner of the cottage, Gretel paused and set down something of her own, a stone she had carried from home, smooth and flat, etched faintly with a star. She placed it near the hearth, then stepped back, saying nothing. The act needed no explanation. As they stepped outside, the air felt newer somehow. Not entirely fresh, but full of potential. Their journey had changed them, taught them things they couldn't yet name. But it had also left them lighter, even with the bundles in their arms. They didn't look back when they walked away from the cottage. There was no need. Somewhere in the distance, a bird began to sing. Its melody was not familiar, but it was soft, and it followed them as they stepped gently into the trees. Each footfall left a small impression on the moss, and above them, branches moved aside with the grace of farewell. They had gathered what they needed, not just in their hands, but in their hearts. And the forest, ancient and aware, was ready to lead them on. The forest, once vast and bewildering, now felt familiar. As Hansel and Gretel moved beneath its dappled canopy, the trees no longer loomed, they listened. Their tall trunks stood like old companions, not blocking the path, but gently shaping it. Sunlight slipped through the leaves in soft strands, casting patterns on the ground that seemed to point the way forward, subtle as threads of gold spun through green. They did not walk with haste. The need to rush had left them. Each step they took was quiet, thoughtful, guided not by maps or memories, but by instinct, by the quiet pull of home that lived deep within their chests. The forest, in turn, offered signs. A brook, gentle and shallow, gurgled in a direction that felt right. A breeze picked up only when they paused at a crossroad, its whisper nudging them softly to the left. Even the birds, fluttering from branch to branch, seemed to flit ahead only along the route they should follow. They moved in silence, save for the soft thud of footfalls and the occasional murmur of wonder. Here, the trees opened slightly, revealing a view of the hills beyond. There, a hollow stump housed a sleeping fox, its ears twitching at their passing but undisturbed. The world was no longer something to be feared. It had unfolded into a place of rhythm and reassurance. Each night, they rested beneath a makeshift shelter of gathered branches and leaves. Hansel would lay out the little food they had saved, just enough to keep them nourished, and Gretel would hum softly, a tune remembered from before the hunger, before the fear. Their sleep was deeper now, less tangled by anxious dreams. When they woke, the light was warm, the path ahead clearer. One afternoon, as the sun arched high overhead, they stumbled upon something small but powerful, a stone. Flat, smooth, and marked faintly with chalk, the very kind Hansel had once used to mark trails near home. It was not one he had dropped, and yet it felt familiar. A sign. A message. A blessing from the woods themselves. Hope bloomed quietly. As the landscape began to change, less dense with trees, more open, more like the land they'd known, the scent of smoke began to reach them. Not the acrid bite of fire, but the soft curl of chimney smoke, touched with pine. And then, a glimpse. The edge of a field, a narrow dirt path, and beyond it, the gentle slope of a familiar hill. Their hearts beat faster, but their pace remained even. It was not the urgency of fear, but the steadiness of certainty. The forest had led them, not with force, but with guidance. And now, just ahead, past a stand of wildflowers bowing gently in the breeze, the shape of a roof came into view. The roof of home. The cottage stood just as they remembered it, tilted slightly to one side, with moss still gathering at the edges of the roof and ivy gently curling around the window panes. Smoke drifted from the chimney in soft spirals, the scent of wood and warmth carried on the breeze. It did not feel like a grand return, but something smaller, quieter. Like a breath let out after being held far too long. Hansel and Gretel stood for a moment at the edge of the clearing, their feet in the grass that had grown slightly taller since they'd last stood there. The morning sun lit the scene in gold, painting the path, the porch, and the familiar wooden door with a glow that made the moment feel both real and like something remembered from a dream. They walked the last few steps together. The door creaked open before they could knock. Their father stood there, eyes wide, hands frozen in place around a piece of kindling. For a long moment, he said nothing. The sunlight caught in the lines on his face, and in his eyes, a flicker of disbelief gave way to something softer, relief, joy, and sorrow braided together. He dropped the kindling and stepped forward, kneeling to embrace them both at once. His arms trembled as they wrapped around the children, drawing them in close, as if afraid they might vanish again if he let go. Gretel pressed her cheek against his shoulder. Hansel held tightly to his coat. No words were spoken, not yet. The embrace said everything. Inside, The cottage was as they remembered, perhaps a little more bare, a little quieter, but it still held the shape of home. The familiar creak of the floorboards welcomed them back, and the light that filtered through the window touched the room gently, as if recognizing their return. Their stepmother was gone. The reason, their father explained later in hushed tones, was simple. She had left not long after they had disappeared, worn down by fear, regret, and the slow, grinding weight of guilt. There had been no anger in his voice as he spoke, only sadness. And in the children's hearts, no bitterness lingered. The forest had taken and returned them, changed them, but it had also softened the sharpest edges. Hansel unpacked the bundle of coins and trinkets, setting them down with quiet purpose. Their father looked on with wonder, not for the wealth, but for the mystery, the evidence of something extraordinary, and the strength his children had found in a world beyond what he could imagine. They did not speak often of what had happened. The tale belonged more to the trees and the wind than to kitchen table stories. But it lived in the way Gretel stirred the pot with care, in the way Hansel stacked the firewood just so, in the way they watched the sun's slow arc across the sky with new understanding. And in time, peace returned. Meals were modest, but full. Laughter came back slowly, like spring after a long winter. And the nights no longer brought fear, but dreams, the kind that leave you smiling as you sleep. The forest, still vast and whispering, stood just beyond the clearing. But it no longer loomed. It had become something else entirely. A place of memory. A path that had once led them away, and now had guided them back. And home, warmed by firelight and quiet joy, cradled them once more. The forest rests now. The path that once wound through shadows and dreams has grown quiet, wrapped in the soft hush of twilight. Leaves no longer rustle with questions, only with calm. The trees stand still, no longer guiding, no longer watching, only present serene, as moonlight settles over their branches like lace. Inside the little cottage at the forest's edge, a gentle fire glows. Its light flickers softly across the walls, casting shadows that sway like lullabies. Hansel and Gretel sleep peacefully in their beds, no longer curled in worry or want, but stretched beneath patchwork quilts, their breaths even and slow. Outside, the stars blink into view, one by one, scattering themselves like breadcrumbs across the sky. The night holds them gently now. No longer lost, no longer searching, the two children rest in the knowledge that the journey is behind them. That they walked through a world of wonder and shadow, and returned changed, not just older, but wiser, softer, and more whole. Their hearts have learned the strength of quiet, the courage of cleverness, and the deep comfort of finding the way back again. The forest, that ancient keeper of stories, knows their tale well. It remembers each step they took, the breadcrumbs, the moonlight, the sweet-walled cottage, the hush of escape, and the steady steps home. It has tucked their story into its roots, so that long after, when wind moves through the trees or light filters down to the mossy floor, echoes of their journey will remain. And you, dear listener, have walked beside them, step by slow step, from the hush of hunger to the warmth of hearth light. Now, your own journey can soften too. Feel the weight leave your shoulders. Let your breath slow and deepen. Let your mind drift like a leaf on still water, unhurried and free. You are not lost. You are not wandering. You are here, held gently by the story, by the night, by the quiet hush of rest. Sleep is close now. Let it wrap around you like a warm quilt. Let your thoughts dissolve like sugar in tea. Let the hush of the forest fill your ears, the scent of pine and bread and stars mingling softly. There is nothing more to do, no path to follow, no steps to retrace. Only rest. Only stillness. Only the soft and steady rhythm of sleep. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. I hope it brought you a little peace, a little wonder, and a little closer to rest. Until next time, sweet dreams.